Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Sheri Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on April 7th, 2023 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. You can also find it on all the major podcasting stations, in case you didn't know that. But if you're on my website page, from there you can scroll down the page and hear the most recent show and or listen to the archived listings of past shows, which you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And a reminder that the show drops now every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. So again, you can listen when it's airing live, or you can listen anytime. And one of the reasons to go to the website instead of another channel or other station or whatever they're called. Yeah, I'm getting older every day, guys. But while you're on the karmicevolution.com podcasting page, you'll see above the most recently posted show a downloadable freebie, which is labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, and which includes friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our individual sun sign, needs to be happy. And this is based on an interview I did with Steve a couple of years ago, and he's given me permission to distribute it more widely as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives far and wide. And yes, if you download it, it'll sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrological newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab that when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some of Stephen Forrest's astrological words of wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, and that's where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content, as you know, if you're not going to sign up for the newsletter, that is, right, because you'll get that there too, and other astro news you can use. I'm also posting on Instagram now under karmic.evolution, but being a writer of many words, a lot of times it's, let's just say, a good writer or a good editor is not a challenge to cut down the number of words, because then more efficient use of words is optimal. But there are times when I just don't have time to do that, like this week. So, for example, I have a whole Libra Full Moon post on my Facebook page that did not make it to the Instagram page because they have so much of a character limitation that, and I'm a Virgo rising, so I like to include everything. The devil is in the details gal. So anyway, you can look there, but if you want consistency, please go to the Facebook page, and that's where you'll find more stuff. So hopefully you haven't all abandoned Facebook yet. And if you have, you'll jot back over to Facebook once in a while just to look at my posts. That would be great. All right. Thanks, guys. All right. And finally, I'm offering still my discounted 75-minute, that's an hour and a quarter, Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, and that's an offer I make to radio show, podcast show listeners only. So if you're interested in astrology, whether you're an astrology student, whether you're an astrology enthusiast, and you want to learn more about your specific birth chart, the meaning of your chart, in order to gain greater consciousness about why you're here, what's your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you're seeking to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back from achieving your most cherished desires, whether that's in the area of relationship, whether it's career and job, whether it's finances and or health, then this is a reading for you. So we will look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime might be keeping you stuck in old habitual patterns or conditioned behavior, and how learning this knowledge can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. A lot of people who study traditional astrology know that, it is a bit more dire in the by the virtue of the fact that it's fatalistic. But modern astrologers, particularly psychological and evolutionary, of which I am both, we believe more that you can change your choices moving forward. And while we cannot ever change the past, we can definitely change the possibilities in the future. So if you'd like to get a better handle on how to co-create your own future happiness, whatever that means to you, through astrological insight, then you should take advantage of my special discounted offer, which you can find at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. And again, that's a 75-minute reading for only $125. And as I like to say, conscious awareness has never been either so easy or so affordable. All right, so let's get into this week's Astro news you can use. Like last week, there's a lot going on, and I have to boil it all down to its generalities, but that's okay. And because I'm a former journalist, a news person, I don't like to record these things too far in advance, and unfortunately, when news breaks, it's difficult. So let's first, because, I don't want to miss anything. If I'm recording this on Thursday evening and it comes out on Friday afternoon, there's a lag time, right? And a lot can happen in some weeks. Some weeks nothing happens, so it doesn't make any difference. But, let's recap for a bit, and I'll explain what I'm talking about it. And I want to look at what led up to this week's Libra Full Moon, which occurred, as many of you probably already know, late on April 5th, or early on April 6th, depending on your time zone, and then at what's occurred since, as occurring right now, and may occur in the future as well. So last week's podcast came out on March 31st, and it included the information that on March 30th, there was a Venus-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. And I said that it would likely lead to sudden shocks or surprises, particularly in how we feel about the value or how we value our current relationships. I didn't mention the announcement that evening of Donald Trump's indictment by the New York District Attorney Alan Bragg, and that's because it happened after I recorded that show. Anyway, since then, we know that many people have had, first of all, we know that many people were caught off guard, right? Trump had already said the week before that he was going to be arrested on a Tuesday, and now this is the following week on Thursday that evening that the indictment is announced. So based on that, we know that many people were taken by surprise. And we also know that since that announcement, since the arraignment, etc., which all occurred this past week, many people have had a rapid change of heart that increased their sense of faith in our justice system. And I would say that it was especially prevalent for those who were continuing to gripe about the lack of speed with which Attorney General Merrick Garland has appeared to move on holding the mastermind of the insurrection on January 6th accountable on a federal level, at least to this point. However, The shifting of values, Venus-Uranus, continued when Mercury entered Taurus and almost immediately afterwards squared Pluto in Aquarius April 3rd. Now, I did mention this last week, but now I'm looking at what actually happened as a result. So the former, Mercury's entrance into Taurus, led to greater communication about things related to values, because that's what Taurus really stands for. Venus is Taurus. And relationships, so our values in relationships, who we value and who we do not. Do we value someone who is free of indictment? Which doesn't mean maybe we should, but that's another story. Or do we value someone who's, run afoul of the law? This is a decision each of us have to make individually, of course. But the Mercury square Pluto also had other people opposing, right? So if Mercury in Taurus, in other words, allowed us to speak out about changed values based on the Venus-Uranus sudden announcements and things, or sudden changes or shocks, and then we speak out about them and say, I don't like him anymore, I'm not going to vote for him, oh my God, his re-election campaign is dead. Others, with the square of Mercury to Pluto, were bound to oppose those who spoke out in that way, or who speak out now. So in other words, some people spoke out about their renewed sense of faith in the justice system, while others railed against the system's lack of justice. And those who praised the developments, as New York District Attorney Alan Bragg announced the indictment of state charges against the twice impeached former President Donald Trump, they were happy to see some movement in bringing Trump to justice, especially since they also know there may be further indictments pending from the Fulton County, Georgia DA Fannie Willis and the U.S. DOJ Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, who I'm sure everybody knows is conducting ongoing investigations, including about both the stolen classified documents found at Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence and his involvement in inciting the January 6th insurrection. However, Mercury square to Pluto also, as noted, highlighted those who opposed Trump's indictment and railed against the justice system rather than in favor of it. And upon learning of the indictment, but not yet its specific charges, Trump's lawyer, for example, Joe Tacopina, noted how shocked his client was at the news, Venus conjunct Uranus, but declared to Fox News 5's online print media, which ran a headline, "The rule of law has died." Okay, Mercury square Pluto. Tacopina's literal quote in the article was this: "Look, the rule of law has been really stretched in this case, and unfortunately for Americans, I think the rule of law today has died." However, when Mercury in Taurus sextiled Saturn in Pisces by April 5th, and we learned the exact nature of Donald Trump's 34-count indictment, we were thus able to more clearly understand the underlying details and their logic, and to discern the forest from the trees, to ultimately be able to determine where our values actually do need to change right now. You see, it's a slow process, right? And Saturn was grounding us. That this coincided with the Aries Sun wounded healer Chiron conjunction that day too reflects how many pundits lamented how April 4th and the spectacle of a twice impeached former president's arraignment in a New York City downtown courthouse was truly a sad day, because it was one that revealed the weakening of trust of the Americans in someone that normally they would be able to trust, because that's why they elected him president, right? So many of these pundits mentioned, or political pundits, I should say, mentioned how the U.S. has now fallen to the level of other countries that have indicted their presidents, their prime ministers, or their leaders, etc., and that this is not something to be joyous about, but rather represents a wound to this nation's reputation in the eyes of the rest of the world. In other words, the U.S. can no longer some would say arrogantly, lord over other nations our pride in our democratic greatness when we're forced to bring to trial a president or a former president accused of crimes who once served in the highest office of the land. And that is also reflective of the Sun Chiron's wound in other places around the world. And unfortunately, I haven't had for quite some time the time to go into the details, but many of us are aware, I know because I have savvy listeners, that in Israel, where its right-wing elected leader Benjamin Netanyahu has attempted to remove judicial oversight, and in Iran, where women are still fighting for legal justice to, not be killed by the morality police if they refuse to hide their hair under a hijab. And all the way to another democratic country like France, where people are still protesting the French president Emmanuel Macron's unilateral decision to increase the retirement age there from 62 to 64. Wouldn't we Americans kill for that? Although I suppose we can take Social Security at 62 also, but certainly not the full amount if we wait longer. But anyway, regardless, that his move has been met with howling protests, and the fact that sanitation workers, unionized workers, have allowed garbage to pile up on the streets, causing quite a big stink. There are certainly many more examples around the world. I've only touched on these few, and I know I'm guilty of leaving other things out, but these are the ones that I felt were worth mentioning now. I'd mention also that in Israel, of course, in the last couple of days, corresponding with the Libra new moons perfecting its lunation, is this religious dispute where over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where several members, Muslim members, decided to barricade themselves inside. And it's interesting because this might have more to do with disinformation. I'm not really sure. When I tried to read the story, even the Associated Press story took almost to the end to actually tell the actual reason why this happened. But from what I gleaned, a good number of Muslims barricaded the doorways inside the mosque because they were afraid. Wednesday night, of course, was the first night of Passover, and they started a few days prior the holy month of Ramadan. So these two religious holidays are intertwined or overlapping, and they were afraid that some of the devout Orthodox Jewish people were going to come into the mosque or Al-Aqsa grounds and sacrifice a goat, which is something that I guess the ultra-Orthodox still do. Honestly, I don't know. But anyway, that sparked this whole thing where the Israeli police came in and shot up the mosque and, arrested people. And there's still a conflagration going on right now, but I don't have all the details. But I just point out that what's clear is that there, I'm going to get into it now because Jupiter here is involved, right? So let's go back for a second to the U.S. What's clear is that this Sun-Chiron conjunction represents a wound that is a recurrence of the energies inherent in the U.S. natal Sibley chart. And that chart has its 13 degree, 19 minute Cancer Sun conjoined to Jupiter at 5 degrees and 56 minutes, and Venus at 3 degrees and 6 minutes of Cancer. And yes, I use very wide orbs. And that is in the U.S. Sibley chart's 7th house of partnership, and in a frictional T-square to our 11th house Saturn at 14 degrees and 48 minutes Libra. So you can see the Cancer Sun is a little less than it's about a little over 1.5 degrees in terms of an orb of a square from the Sun to Saturn. And that Saturn is conjoined to the goddess asteroid Juno, who represents partnership, at 20 degrees and 27 minutes of Libra. And Saturn and Juno oppose while the Sun squares wounded healer Chiron in the U.S. Sibley chart's 4th house at 20 degrees and 8 minutes of Aries. You can see particularly tight is this Juno opposition to Chiron, 2027 Libra to 2008 Aries. And of course, I extend that to the Saturn at 1448 and the Sun at 1319. So upon the birth of this nation, or our founding, at least according to this well-known and oft-used Sibley chart, those of you who listen to or read other astrologers, you'll see all kinds of different charts that people use. I've been using this one. It seems to work, but I also am not a stickler for these orbs and things like that. And really, if you're looking at just a day or two difference, you're looking at a difference in the moon. You're looking at a difference in the ascendant and the moon. Those are the two big things. But I like a Sag rising because, as Mitchell Lewis, my friends, likes to say, this nation is identified from its inception with adventure and with expansion and moving forward, and of course the concept of manifest destiny. And now that makes sense to me. Also, Gemini, Mercury's Gemini ruling the descendant or the house of partnership makes sense too, because we have a lot of communication with a lot of our partners, both internally and externally. So that may sound simplistic, but sometimes when you boil it all down, astrology is kind of simplistic. It just depends on how you want to look at it, right? So anyway, according to this Sibley chart, the U.S. was born with a sensitivity around the woundedness to its own sense of self-identity. That's the Sun square Chiron, and Chiron in the sensitive moon-ruled 4th house. Okay, he's in Aries, but he's in the Cancer, moon's Cancer-ruled 4th house, which makes him sensitive. He's sensitive. The Sun's sensitive, because it squares wounded healer Chiron, saying there's a wound there. And then he's even more sensitive because Chiron's in the 4th house. And the kind of self-isolation that the U.S. has exhibited for a good portion of its existence that breeds loneliness and a lack of trust in authority figures. So in other words, the U.S. was born wounded by its need to separate from its original quote-unquote father, the King of England, but in doing so, never really developed a clear sense of ego identity that loses its kind of knee-jerk reaction to feeling in some way oppressed. The Sun square Saturn can indicate an insecurity, can indicate difficulties with authority figures. So it also represents restriction imposed by authority figures. And because the Sun conjoins Jupiter, Jupiter also squares Saturn in my world. And that tends toward a kind of push, pull, stop, go energy that results in confusion about whether to expand or to contract. It's a 1 foot on the gas pedal, 1 foot on the brake kind of energy. So there may be the tendency to sometimes lose a sense of reality about what's realistically possible. That's the Jupiterian part. Right? Let's shoot for the moon. Yay, let's go over the rainbow. So they lose, it's a pie in the sky kind of let's just go. Again, Jupiter is adventurous, right? And the sky's the limit, but it smacks into a kind of deflationary energy because what Jupiter wants to do may not be realistically possible. So he runs into Saturn, and then Saturn gets depressed or upset or, lonely and feeling like a failure because the goal that Jupiter hatched can't be achieved. And that's especially true if Jupiter doesn't deal with the details, because Jupiter ruled Sagittarius loves to, see the big picture, but a lot of times can just gloss over all of the details and not pay them any mind and then get caught up in the end by those details. So I'm sure that everyone can come up with plenty of examples of, how this might apply throughout history And, you might want to ponder, like even for just a few minutes, that there's 9/11 and George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq based on false information, for starters. We could go to the evacuation of Afghanistan and the, overestimation of either how long it would take or what was needed to make it happen, etc., etc. And those are only recent things. There's plenty throughout the entire history of this country. Some of you probably know much better than me. You may be history buffs, history students, history teachers, etc. So what's interesting is that this Libra full moon fell on the Saturn. The Libra moon was on the Saturn and the Juno, opposed the Chiron and squared the Sun and Jupiter, and by extension the Venus there, right? So the full moon, the Libra full moon triggered this T-square. So it would seem to be no accident that Trump, when president, because he also has a stellium in his chart, which I've talked about before, which is a second house Juno Chiron, very tight conjunction, and then only a few degrees away is Jupiter, all right? So this kind of combination is Jupiter-Chiron, which is coming up next week. We're going to have a Jupiter-Chiron conjunction on April 11th, which I'll mention in a few. It ties into Trump's chart. And so, again, it would seem to be no accident that Trump, when president, rekindled America's isolationist tendencies, its problems with authority figures, etc., from outside the country, that these existed from the country's origin until so many years later is evidenced by the U.S. reluctance to get involved in the first two world wars in the 20th century until it became impossible to sit them out any longer. And that's particularly after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that killed so many Americans, soldiers and civilians. So, or Navy people at the port in Hawaii in Pearl Harbor. So that all of this emphasis on past hurts, pain, and wounding was building during the waxing phase of this month's lunar cycle, which really began on March 21st with the Aries new moon at 0 degrees and 50 minutes of the sign of new beginnings, might seem obvious now. These energies also pushed through the Cancer Moon-Mars conjunction and the first quarter waxing cardinal lunar square on March 28th, both of which I talked about last week, and reached their crescendo at this recently passed Libra full moon, which opposed the Aries Sun at 16 degrees and 7 minutes of the zodiacal polarity. And as I mentioned before, again, I didn't mention the exact times, but that was at 9:34 Pacific time on April 5th and 12:34 a.m. Eastern time, April 6th. So, a little over 24 hours ago from the time that this podcast will drop. And that's depending, of course, on your time zone. So the Libra full moon, which I believe is something I mentioned last week, is opposed not only to the Aries Sun. A full moon is when the moon always opposes the sun, right? But this time the Libra full moon also opposed wounded healer Chiron and Jupiter too, because the three were, and right now as I speak still are, traveling together. And that's because the Aries Sun at the lunation was barely pulling away by only minutes of arc from his Chiron conjunction. And he's now waxing toward his meetup with Jupiter, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, which is going to perfect on April 11th. So this energy is still very strong. Now, similarly, the Libra moon exact opposed Chiron just prior to the exact lunation on April 5th or 6th, depending on your time zone, and then opposed Jupiter in Aries on April 6th. The Libra moon also quincunxed Uranus and Taurus at this lunation, which was just yet another, maybe more minor sign that there might be rapid adjustments being made in terms of what we value, related particularly to valuing our relationships. So when we look at all this together, and we use the art of astrological synthesis to blend these energies into a meaningful whole, we can see that we need only observe what's playing out in real time within the collective now and use this information to better understand the deeper meaning of this Libra full moon's opposition to this stellium in Aries. So we may look now, we may widen the lens a little, look now at where society, particularly in the U.S., but by far not only here, as I mentioned before, where society has become wounded by its distrust or lack of faith in the moral justice of the legal system, which of course is a Jupiterian archetypal theme. Or we could look at where we've been hurt through martial independence, related to Mars-ruled Aries, which is the sign through which Chiron and the Sun and Jupiter are transiting, which doesn't consider anyone's, read a partner's, needs or desires except for their own, read selfishness. These are the shadow sides of Aries, right? So we know that in its worst form, the Aries archetype often acts impatiently, impetuously, selfishly, and angrily. And that can sometimes extend to actual violence. So I discussed this at great length during last week's podcast, based both on the violence wrought by Mother Nature herself, whose destruction of her body, the earth, has been both denied and neglected for so long, and the man-made violence highlighted at the time by yet another school shooting in Nashville, Tennessee, that took the lives of 3 9-year-old children and 3 adults, and more. Now, I've said before on this podcast that Jupiter in Aries likes to fight for a cause. And when transiting through the sign of the god of war, Aries, Jupiter still represents religion, literal travel, and higher education, meaning travel of the mind, including into philosophical discussion about morals and the law. But Jupiter's shadow side is arrogance. So particularly when Jupiter's transiting through fiery, I read that wrong. So particularly when transiting through fiery Aries, Jupiter can expand his focus on any righteously held beliefs about which he's ultra sensitive since, as I also pointed out at great length last week, Mars, which rules the zodiacal sign Aries, is currently transiting through sensitive, moody, moon-ruled Cancer now. So in essence, the more we feel hurt, both collectively and privately, the more likely we may be to lash out offensively rather than to sit down and dialogue with those who've hurt us most as part of our best defense. When we look again at the particular front and center topics, especially since Jupiter entered Aries nearly a year ago on May 10th, 2022. Of course, that time he did also retrograde back into Pisces, but still, he's coming to the end of that run soon in May, so when he'll be entering Taurus, and I forget what date that is. It's either the 11th or maybe 21st. But anyway, we can see exactly the wounds being highlighted through the collective now. 1, xenophobia, a lack of all-inclusiveness based on the belief that others, based on their culture, race, religion, gender identification, etc., are not equals and thus are to be feared, and or I would say in some way repressed, oppressed, conquered, right? 2nd, a supersized sensitivity around children, causing fights over their exposure to the kind of elementary learning of factual history, that's also Jupiter's domain, that leads to higher education's critical thinking skills and ultimately to higher consciousness. Again, Jupiter. And 3, that the tendency right now to fight for such beliefs based on one's righteously exaggerated sense of their importance places more emphasis on the fight than on the achieving of such belief-based causes in the end. Now, the Libra full moon, again in effect right now, but waning, at least until we reach the 2nd Aries new moon on April 20th, which also will happen to be a solar eclipse at 29 Aries. But the Libra full moon's waning portion of the monthly lunar cycle urges us still to release any anger or vengefulness we mistakenly feel is necessary to help us heal. And instead, the Libra moon preaches negotiation and compromise to better understand the derivation of our wounds, and that forgiving others ultimately helps us forgive ourselves too. Now, there's the Venus-Neptune sextile waxing at this lunation, perfected also April 7th, helps stimulate both our creative and empathic natures, granting us the opportunity to feel acutely the needs and emotions of others. Perhaps, I thought to myself, this is part of the calculation by those who believe pessimistically that the justice system is dead, and that's what led to Trump's fundraising success since his announced indictment and arraignment. The rest of us, though, due in part to Mercury's sextile to Mars in Cancer, late April 7th or early on the 8th, gain the confidence to express our positive ideas and opinions about our faith in the justice system forcefully and convincingly, while managing to avoid arguments or more negative pushback. And that makes this lunation an excellent time to move away from or let go of the past and clear a path for a new one into a more rewarding future. So it's now that we might want to ask ourselves on a more personal level a couple of these questions. One, where has my personal sense of justice been wounded in the past by not being able to do or say what I wanted freely, prevented in particular by someone in authority who may have been playing God? As my dad used to say to my mom, occasionally when they got into an argument, and my mother was a Saturn-ruled Capricorn sun, used to say, "Shirley, who died and made you God?" Which now, of course, is funny, but back then maybe wasn't. Anyway, 2, what are my personal moral beliefs about what constitutes justice, and where might these be wounded? And 3, how can I better heal this wound now without resorting to anger, but rather to dialogue and due process with those who I feel have wronged me? Now, again, as I was saying at the beginning of this podcast, I'm a news hound, right? And I like to provide astrological interpretations with up-to-the-minute news. And there's a lag time between now and when you're going to hear this, as there are with most podcasts. But one of the major crescendos of this Libra full moon, which is waning now, seems to me to be seen clearly in what's going on right now in Nashville, Tennessee, because today, which is your yesterday, the state legislature is voting to oust 3 Democratic lawmakers who protested on the chamber floor with a bullhorn to call for gun reform following last month's, which was really only like 2 weeks ago. I think it was March 28th. It was that Monday. Hang on a second. I'll tell you. I think it was last Monday, which is March 27th. Okay? And today is, the 7th. So we're talking 10 days. So they protested on the chamber floor with a bullhorn to call for gun reform following that day's school shooting in Nashville. And now they're being accused of breaking the House legislature's rules, and that's according to CBS News. So this is a quote from that article. The 3 lawmakers led a protest on the House floor last Thursday, and that's the state legislature's House floor, not the national one, without being recognized, CNN affiliate WSMV reported, using a bullhorn as demonstrators at the state capitol called on lawmakers to take action to prevent further gun violence. The protest came after 3 9-year-olds and 3 adults were killed in a mass shooting on March 27th, there it is, at the Covenant School, a private Christian school. Each was removed from their committee assignments following last week's demonstrations. And the article continues, protesters flooded the state capitol as the legislators were set to take up three resolutions filed by GOP lawmakers Monday seeking to expel Reps. Gloria Johnson of Knoxville, Justin Jones of Nashville, and Justin Pearson of Memphis, a step the State House has taken only twice since the 1860s. Quote, "It's morally insane that a week after a mass shooting took 6 precious lives in my community here in Nashville, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, their first action is not to take actions to rein in this proliferation of weapons of war in our streets, but it's to expel their colleagues for standing with our constituents," Jones told CNN this morning on Wednesday. Quote, "This is not just about losing my job," he added, saying constituents of the 3 representatives are being taken and silenced by a party that is acting like authoritarians. He ended his remarks by saying that the world is watching and telling the world is watching, Jones told the legislative body just before they voted 72 to 25 to oust him from their ranks. Now, they may have voted already. I had to sit down and record this podcast to oust the other 2. One of the representatives, Gloria Johnson, was on MSNBC yesterday, and she told the audience that she was informed that if she resigned by the end of day yesterday, she would be able to keep her health insurance, but if she did not, she would lose it. So, I mean, there's so much wrong with this, but my point is in talking about how the attack on democracy is just so insane, and that leads me to say that this Sun Chiron Jupiter conjunction now is not to be taken lightly. And many astrologers disregard Chiron completely, but doing so precludes the ability to read the stars correctly at this particular point in time, at least in my opinion. So I'm going to give you a little bit more background on Chiron for those who are unfamiliar. Chiron has proven important since he was discovered in 1977 by Charles Cowell, orbiting the Sun between Saturn and Uranus, and first identified member of a new class of objects now known as centaurs, or bodies orbiting between the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt. As per Wikipedia, and here I quote, "Although it was initially called an asteroid and classified only as a minor planet with the designation 2060 Chiron, in 1989 it was found to exhibit behavior typical of a comet. Today it is classified as both a minor planet and a comet, and is accordingly also known by the cometary designation 95P/Chiron. Chiron is named after the centaur Chiron in Greek mythology, and here I'm adding my own words, who was wounded in the crossfire of a battle not of his own making, and who suffered greatly until put out of his misery by the gods, who allowed his immortality to wane, and upon death was placed as a constellation in the sky. And this is why he's known as the wounded healer. So in modern times, astrologers use him to identify where deeply hidden wounds, some may be hidden, some not, either through mundane events that have arisen within the collective, or in personal chart readings, we look to identify the derivation of such wounds. So Chiron's presence at this lunation so strongly therefore indicates society's wounds related to our persona, or how we identify who we are and what we stand for. Okay? And that's something that I just pointed out that is inherent in the birth chart of the United States. It's also where we're wounded to the Jupiterian archetypes, because that Sun, it's a Chiron Sun Jupiter conjunction, because Jupiterian archetypes are associated, as I said before, with religion and the all-inclusiveness gained through the exposure by travel and learning which is how we develop our philosophies about life. The more we know, the more expansive our philosophies are, the more all-inclusive we tend to be, right? In addition, Jupiter's themes include morals, something I mentioned before, such as those derived from our, not everyone, but pretty much in the Western monotheistic religious world, they're derived from our religious indoctrination. And we also know that our morals, and I always tell the story, to me it's like, okay, so Moses got the 10 Commandments from God, and the 10 Commandments became part of Western civilization's laws. Thou shalt not kill, right? And if one does kill, then we have a moral obligation to punish them. Then, of course, we could go on for hours about what those punishments should, would, or could be, and what they are, and whether they're morally right or not morally right. And that's what Jupiter's all about, that kind of discussion, right? But to bottom line it, it's how much morality translates into the concept of justice, and how the need for justice provides any given society with its system of law. Now, we go back to what's going on now with Donald Trump. We go back to what's going on in Tennessee and other legislatures where, again, they're trying in Tennessee to oust these 3 democratically elected state legislature officials, 2 lawmakers. 2 are black men, young black men, and 1 is a woman, because they were protesting the lack of the legislature's interest in drawing up any gun regulation legislation. I think anyone who follows the news and hopefully astrology can see how black is white and white is black, and how cognitively dissonant this entire globe really has become, in large part, in my opinion anyway, due to the disinformation that spread so rapidly through channels like those of social media. But anyway, I'll get down from that soapbox, because then we get into a First Amendment discussion. And I think that's part of what they'll be probably saying in Tennessee. But here's another interesting, thought. 3 lawmakers who are constitutionally elected by their constituents, those constituents just lost their representatives. I believe Justin Jones said 70 or 72,000 people now are without a legal representation in the state legislature, and the other 2 would probably, will triple that, if not more. So they've just disenfranchised voters. So that's the point that I want to make. Anyway, so I had mentioned already that this is interesting in large part because it's evident that it's affecting the chart of the United States of America, which is the Sibley chart that I use, and how this child wounded by the parent theme becomes obvious over and over again, right? Because we're dealing with 2 different factions. One, usually the conservative faction, is the more authoritative one, or the one that acts like the authority figure or the parent, bringing to task the more liberal or free-spirited or all-inclusive or more accepting or whatever portion of the population that doesn't want to be corralled or restricted. So, it's going to be interesting to see whether other legislatures around the country follow suit. But I do believe, and this factors into the fact that Pluto has entered Aquarius. I was going to talk today more about the solar eclipse coming on the 21st. Clearly, I'll do that next week. But I want to tell you 2 things. Number 1, the themes of the solar eclipse usually start to emerge about 3 weeks before the eclipse itself. And I'm getting off track here, But what I want to say before I finish, so I don't neglect to include it, is, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but according to Bernadette Brady, the traditional astrologer who tracked all the Saros series eclipses over the past 2,000 or 1,500 years, equates this particular one coming up on April 20th with the Aries new moon at the anaretic degree of 29 Aries with sexual stuff. Okay? So if you're looking to find a way to say, oh, you can't make this shit up when you're talking to your friends about astrology, then I would remind you that with sexuality, sexual scandals, sudden sexual stuff emerging, that we just had basically about 3 weeks before this next eclipse, the first one of the spring season for 2023, that we had a major indictment. Well, you might say maybe it's not major because it's a state one and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to argue about that. You can listen to any news channel you want and read any papers you want about whether these New York DA's case will stick against Trump. However, it's based on the hush money payments, which I think everyone knows because you've seen that over and over again, right? The point is that, of course, they linked it to influencing his campaign for president, and that's where it became a felony. Anyway, regardless of that, I just want to mention that. So next week I'm going to talk more about the eclipse itself before it actually happens. But what I was saying before, too, is that there is, the states rebelling against the federal authorities, and now, like what we're seeing in Tennessee, they're actually imploding internally, right? So this Libra Full Moon really highlighted where there can be an us versus them, even more so within the ranks of people who actually share the same responsibilities, which is to work for their constituents on a political level to make their lives better. Anyway, let me finish out so that I don't leave you hanging. I want to say that Venus is going to enter chatty, curious Gemini late on April 10th or early the 11th. And when Venus goes into Gemini, she's a bit more flirty, she's a bit more loquacious, she's a bit more fickle, that's the stereotypical, a little more distracted, and little bit more prone to gossip than to checking factual information. So watch that you understand everything, the derivation of everything you hear, or take it with a grain till you can verify it on Snopes or something like that. But Venus will also form an Aries trine to Pluto in Aquarius that increases our emotional intensity and enhances our relationships, as long as we can avoid compulsive behavior now. And partnership-oriented asteroid Juno, who I mentioned, who is prominent in Donald Trump's Juno, Chiron, and Jupiter stellium in his second house in Libra, joins changemaker Uranus in Taurus, also on April 10th, signaling again a potential shift in alliances based on our changing values. And then the Aries Sun, of course, meets Jupiter on April 11th, which can infuse us with optimism, faith, and hope for the future. But we also want to watch out for its shadow side, as I've been saying, which is excessive pride, extreme arrogance, especially by those in power now, which is exactly what we're starting to see play out in places like Tennessee. Now, what I started to say before and then lost my train of thought is that a lot of what's going on now in the very, very big picture realm is Pluto's move into Aquarius. And I've said before that this is a revolutionary kind of energy, and that Pluto will be in Aquarius until June, I think it's 10th or 11th, and then will backtrack retrograde into Capricorn. We are going to see the two sides duking it out. We are going to see more and more people hit the streets, just as we did when Saturn ingressed Aquarius and then retrograded back into Capricorn during the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests after he was murdered by a police officer who is an authority figure in this society at least, and who is shielded by qualified immunity, right? So we saw the breakdown of that because now he's in prison after being tried and found guilty of murder, all right? So watch this space because you're seeing it, and I think if you watch any of the footage from what tomorrow will be yesterday's vote in the Tennessee legislature chambers, you'll see the protesters there and how they are made up mostly of young people, people of color. And we also know, which I didn't mention before, that the Democrat won the Supreme Court position in the state of Wisconsin, and that was on Wednesday, and also that the mayor of Chicago, who is more liberal, won there. And a large part, mostly of the Wisconsin election, hinged on their restrictive abortion laws. Because when the Supreme Court Dobbs decision came down, that state reverted back to an I can't remember now if it's 1859 or 69 or 79, but all of it is too old for me, law that outlawed abortion. And I don't remember now if it was after 6 weeks or just entirely. So either way, though, it's not like this is a gloom and doom prediction, but it is more like, pay attention because, as I said, Pluto in Aquarius is going to start sparking people to move. And these egregious abuses of power are going to be opposed. So, I've got to wind up now, and I want to thank you all for listening today, and to say that I hope you found this information helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week, April 14th, when, yes, I'll talk more about this upcoming solar eclipse and other good stuff, and Mercury's upcoming retrograde on April 21st. So join me then for another episode of Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. Till then, namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.